In this video, we'll continue where we left off, adding the roof rafters and making adjustments to the beam ends and the ridge beam location to bring this thing further along. So we can see we have here the 3D view open as we look at it, and there are some things that are good about it, and there are some things that aren't quite right about it. The biggest issue really right now is that our roof is floating and it's not connected in the right way to the structure below. And that's in part because we're missing our rafters that we need to add inside of here. So the next thing I'm going to do is add some rafters to this. And we're going to do this by using a special feature called, if we go to the structure tab here, a beam system. And a beam system is a way of putting in a lot of repetitive elements that have either a fixed distance spacing or a spacing that you want a certain number of items in at a certain distance apart minimally or something like that. So this works really well for things like rafters, floor joists, girders, ceiling joists, any of those kinds of things. I suppose you could even do this with wall framing if you actually had a reference plane to work in and had a vertical beam system. You could do studs with this, I'm sure, if you needed to actually model those. But in this case, we're going to use the underside of our roof. Now, there are a couple ways this can be done. We could, in fact, draw our beam system flat on the ground like floor joists and then rotate them into position. I believe that's the way the written assignment shows you to do it. But I'm going to show you a little bit faster way of doing it here using the reference plane of the underside of our roof assembly right now to actually host the beam system instead. So to be able to see what's really going on here, I'm going to switch my view from realistic into hidden line. I don't recommend typically working in realistic view. I think it's much better when you're in hidden line. You can kind of see things better, and then the lines aren't hidden by what you're seeing. I'm also going to make certain I have thin line turned on so I can really see things. The extra thick lines kind of obscure some of my view of the objects here. So now I can see I've got this system here, and what I next want to do is go ahead and start my beam system. So I'm going to click on the beam system tool, and you'll notice that it's asking me to sketch a boundary line for my beam. But before I do that, I want to take a look at the beam system that's in use right now. So you can see that there's a structural beam system here, it is a fixed distance spacing of 6 feet apart for each beam. That would be great if you were working on, say, a steel frame building of some sort where you had heavy W-shaped beams and things. But in this case, it doesn't make sense, and in particular, we don't want to use a 6 by 12 for our rafters. So I'm going to want to use a different framing system for this. So I'm going to click Edit Type. I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to call this my Pergola rafters. Now, again, this is a situation where you might want to actually give it more explicit naming information, like 2x8s at 24 inches on center or something like that. I'm just going to keep it generic for purposes of what I'm doing here. I'm going to click OK, and then click OK. I've got my new type created. And then I'm going to go ahead and take a look at what I have available here. So you'll see the layout rule says use a fixed distance of 6 feet. I don't like that, so I'm going to change this to every 2 feet instead. I'm going to leave it centered. That means that when it takes a look at the boundary of the area that's defined by the footprint, it means that it will center a rafter in the middle of that boundary and then space them equally from the center out. That means that the ends of the rafter runs, basically at the rake lines of your building, you'll end up with an oddball sized rafter potentially. So I'm going to drop this down and select a different rafter, and you'll notice here I don't have the right size loaded here, so I have to load it. So first I'm going to click Apply just so it remembers these settings, and then I'm going to go to the Insert menu, and then I'm going to click Load Family, and then from here I'm going to go down to the structural framing place we were at before, again to the wood folder, and then I'm going to open up the dimensional lumber framing here. This is probably a better one to use for this because it'll have 2x8s inside of it and other sizes as well. I want to use a 2x8 for this rafter. I've decided ahead of time. So I'll double click the lumber one, and you can see here all the different size lumber, sawn on 4 sides, or sanded 4 sides lumber I can use. I'm going to pick the 2x8, And just for fun, I'll pick a few more just in case I want to use them somewhere else in the project for some other thing. I'll click OK. It'll load those. So now I can go back to my beam system here, and I can drop this down and tell it to use a dimensional lumber 2x8 for my dimensional lumber. Great, so that takes care of that. I'm going to click on the tab at the top, the Modify Create Beam System boundary, to return to my beam system here. Now what I want to do is I actually want to set the underside of my roof plane to actually draw my beam system in. So I'm going to click the button at the top here in the work plane, Set. And then I can use the Pick a Plane option here. I don't want to default to level 2. I don't want this to be a horizontal system. I'm going to click OK. And now if I move to the underside of my roof rafter, I can pick the underside of my roof rafter. Be careful not to pick the top edge like this. You really want to place it on the underside of your roof. I'll click here. And now I can go ahead and sketch my boundary. All I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to use the Pick Line tool, just so you can see where I'm sketching in. If I press the Show button here, if you're ever confused about what you pick for your reference plane, you can always click the Show button here and it will show you where your reference plane is at. So now that I know I'm sketching in that plane, I'm going to use the Pick Line, and then I'll just pick these edges that you see here and here, and what it's doing is it's projecting those surfaces upward onto this plane that I have here. I'll pick this one here and this one here, down here, like that. So you can see if I orbit around here, you can see very clearly what it's done here is it simply extended those planes onto the plane that my work plane that I'm working on. Now I'm going to do something a little bit sneaky here. I want these rafters to extend out past my ridge beam. So I'm actually going to take this line here and I'm actually going to drag it up about like this. And because I might want to have some exposed rafter tail on these, I'm going to drag this downwards as well. It's a sketch, so I have to clean these up. So I'll issue the TR alias to allow me to corner trim these two lines together like that. These ones here are fine. I can tell by looking at them. So I know I'm okay. Now, one thing I want to bring to your attention is that this boundary line right now is actually the direction of the roof rafters. If you wanted your roof rafters to run the other way, and you might be doing something where maybe you've got lattice work on top of this that runs horizontally, you can actually use the beam direction tool and pick a different element here, and now my beams would run this way, would run horizontally across this roof surface here. So if you had to build up, say, a trellis or a lattice work where you needed multiple layers of framing members that were spaced or run perpendicularly to one another, you could effectively build up a trellis like this and then simply set the reference work plane on top or the bottom of each layer of that trellis as you were building upwards. I want to change the direction to here, so I'm going to click that. The other thing is I should point out is in the location for the layout here, you'll notice the justification says center. But one of the interesting options here is the direction line. You can either say start it from the beginning, the end, or the direction line. So if I knew for sure I wanted to have a beam at a very specific location, I could actually pick this beam direction tool, choose my line tool, and I could actually draw the actual beam direction in with this one. So now this beam is actually going to determine the 2 feet on center spacing beginning point for that layout. Should also point out that you don't have to have your directions totally perpendicular or parallel to your boundary edges. You can see that what I have drawn here now would actually result in rafters that went at an angle across this roof surface here. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to just select this one and tell it to make that my beam direction. And now it's set up the way I expect it to be set up. I'm going to click check. And now you can see, lo and behold, here is my beam system on the underside of my building. So now I can start to think about how this thing is going to work in terms of the framing, how high the roof needs to be able to sit properly on the building itself. I want to point out that the beam system is connected to the work plane right now, And if you need to, you can tab select to find that. So find a beam and then just tab select. You'll eventually light that up. And if you move this beam system, it moves all of the rafters for you. So you don't try to move the rafters. In fact, if you select one of the rafters, you'll notice it's pinned. So it's technically part of this beam system, and it moves with the beam system. If you wanted to disengage it and copy it perhaps, or move it around, like I'm going to eventually have to copy one to the outside maybe. Maybe not. I'll see how the rafter's laid out. That's when I can just copy it this way, but if I wanted to edit it beyond that and move it around further or customize it in some way, I would need to unpin it first. All right, so let's take a look now at how this thing sits and how this beam works together in terms of the framing. So I want to go to my front elevation. So just as a reminder, if you take a look at your view cube, I would recommend you find the orientation you want to view it on. Don't click on these because technically that's still a three-dimensional view. Find the appropriate direction that you want to view from, and in this case I want to look at it from the south, and then find the true orthogonal view, the true elevation view for this. I can see I'm in fine level detail, so I need to change this to, I need to change this to fine. Now I can start to see some information here on my roof rafters. The first thing I'll notice is that the way the beam is interacting with this rafter here, it's requiring somebody to make a really strange cut in this beam that has three cuts on it. That's not the way you would typically cut a rafter to sit on top of a beam. Typically you create what's called a bird's mouth, which if you take the resultant piece, which would be a triangular shape, looks kind of like a bird's beak. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it up so that this intersection that's right here is at the corner of the beam, so these have full bearing. Now if I wanted to, say for instance, if I wanted this to only have a 2 or a 3 inch bearing here and a point on the rafter be resting right here when it extends upward, I could actually use something like a dimension or even a line to do that. Pretty easy to do. Let me show you a way to accomplish that. I'm going to go into wireframe view to make this easier to do. I'm going to go to my annotate tab and I'm going to issue the detail line command. And then I'm going to pick a line and I'm going to give it an offset of 2 inches. And now I'm going to move to this line here, and you can now see that I've just created this line. I'll stretch it up a little bit. This little line that is exactly 2 inches away from the corner of the building. Here I'll dimension, or the corner of the beam. Let me dimension it using my tab select option here, and you can see that line is exactly 2 inches away here. So if I really wanted to have a 2 inch bearing on here, I could now cross through and select my roof and my rafter system and my beam system. And now I'm just going to use a move command and move it from this intersection here of the bottom of my rafter and that vertical line I created up to this intersection here. And now you can see I have exactly a 2 inch bearing point for this rafter. You'll notice too that the rafter cuts through this beam, and it's almost like it's slicing through the beam. We really want to physically cut this, and I'll show you how to do that when we get to cleaning this up a little bit more. But for now, I'm just trying to get it placed properly. I'm going to undo that just to show you how I can now move it so that it has a full seat here. I'll again cross to the left. When you're picking things in Revit, be aware that if you pick a point and move to your left, either up and down, it's going to select anything that touches that rectangle. If you pick a point and move to the right, it's only going to pick things that are fully contained within there, whether you move up or down. So you can see right now it's not picking anything. Well, that's because I have to move to the left, and that will then allow me to pick these objects. So now I'm going to use my move command again. I'll snap to this intersection here, and I'll just bring it up to this endpoint here. So now my rafters have true full bearing on this corner of the building the way I expect them to. Okay. All right, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing with this beam. Right now I can take this beam and move it up and down pretty easily with the move command in the same way. But really what I want to do is I want to cut these rafters first so that they stop at the peak here. So to do that, and then I can move this beam down so that it lines up perfectly with the end of this rafter, and then there will be a little bird's mouth cut out of the top of the rafter here. So to do this, I'm going to use a sneaky trick. I'm going to go to the Architecture tab. It's not actually a trick, it's just a method of working. I'm going to create a reference plane by using the reference plane tool. And I'm going to draw a reference plane at the center of my roof upwards like this. Okay. Now, it doesn't have to extend all the way down, but if it makes you more comfortable to see what's going on here, you can do that. Okay. So a plane is simply a reference plane that you can sketch in, and it has other useful features too, and you're about to see one right now. I'm going to use this to trim all of these rafters here. So to do this, I'm going to go to my Modify tab, and then I'm going to go to, on the Geometry panel, the Cut tool. Read your command line or your status bar, and it'll say pick element to be cut. So I'm going to pick this element here, which is probably the frontmost rafter in my elevation view. Okay. Before I do that though, notice up on the option bar there is a multiple cut option. So don't click too quickly when you're picking commands and options. Read your option bar. Make certain you know what it's asking you if you want to do, or the options that you have to work with. So I'm going to select multiple cut because I have many rafters here I want to cut. So now it's saying pick the element to be cut. So I'm going to pick this side of the rafter. Always pick the side you want to keep. I'll pick here. And then it's saying pick the reference plane or the family instance to cut with. And I'm going to pick this one instead. Now if you look carefully, you'll notice that there's actually a solid black line there because I've actually cut this portion of the front rafter off. Since I have multiple cuts selected here, I can move on top of the edge here, and it's picking the next rafter there. I'm going to click that. Click again, click again, click again, click again, click again, click again. If I keep clicking, you can see eventually I'm going to reach a point where it no longer selects a rafter. So all of those rafters now were successively cut one at a time simply by using that multiple cut option. It goes very quickly when you do that. Now what I want to do is I want to take this, since I've already got this much done, I might as well use my mirror tool to put it over on this side. So I'm going to cross through this. I'm going to deselect with the shift key my roof. I don't want to mirror it. And then I can use this reference plane as a mirror by picking the axis on it. And I can pick that. You can see it's created the same beam system. The cantilever's out this way. Now, if I had picked the reference plane and mirrored it as well, it also would have mirrored the cuts. But I didn't really feel comfortable having about two reference planes on top of each other there. So it's really easy just to go back and use the cut tool, multiple cut, pick this one, pick this reference plane again, and then simply click very quickly here. And you can see it just takes a few seconds to trim those out. Now I can take a look at this beam here, how it's working in relationship to these rafters. Again, what you would typically do is select the element you want to move, select your move tool, pick this beam, and then move it to its correct location. So I'm just going to move it straight down here. And now you can see that beam moves exactly where I want it to. So they would cut a little bird's mouth in the top of the rafter here. And then the last thing we need to do here is you'll notice that if you look at this line that's created here, that's because when we created this beam here, we snapped to these posts, but we didn't attach these posts to the beam. So I'm going to attach them. I'll do this from a 3D view so you can see it a little bit more easily as I do this. So let me go here. I'm going to hide my roof temporarily, element hide. And now I can see my king posts inside of here. You can see they stick up into the beam. So I can select one and attach top base again. And this time I'm going to select the top and I'm going to pick this beam. You can see it matches up perfectly now. Select this one, attach top base, confirm that top is selected, pick that. I'm going to cancel out of that and not worry too much about that at this point, and then pick this one. It may do the same function here where it says it needs to be detached as well. So I'm not going to worry about that, because the other way we can do this too is if we know what the height is, we can actually give it a height here for this as well. But I won't worry too much about that right now. All right, so let's talk about the finishing up on these. Let me see, I want to detach this one. Let's detach top base. I'm going to say detach all, and then I'm going to select this one and say attach top base again, and click on this one for the top. Cancel. I'm going to disallow join on this. So I'm going to right click here and I'm going to say disallow join. I'm going to take this one now and say attach top base, top here, and that's fixed now. And now I'm going to select this one and I'm going to give it, drag this out some here like that. Okay, so that's fixed. Let's do the other side too, just to make it pretty. Take this one here. I'm pausing on this little circle. That's the dot that controls how these things are joined. I'm going to right click on top of it and I'm going to say disallow join. That breaks the connection that they share. So what I'm going to do now is select this one, tell it to attach top base, and then make sure top is selected, and I'll pick this one. And now I can select this column and then drag this out to make it cantilever out again. Now I'm happy with the way that looks. All right. So with Revit, sometimes you have to figure multiple ways of getting that task done to make it work properly. All right, so now my structural framing all looks pretty complete for what I expect to see for this building. The next thing I'm going to do is, in the next video, show you how you go about cleaning up the connection and the joints between all of these parts so they look reasonable. You'll notice, for instance, you don't see a line here. So I'll show you how to physically cut those birds' mouths in there. And then I'll work on putting some rafter tails, decorative cuts, and on the beam cuts as well. When all of that is done, then perhaps I'll dress this up with some additional site entourage and some barbecue or something. So let me stop here this video at this, and we'll continue in the next one.